The crack of my brother's palm against the side of my face echoed off every wall in that banquet hall. 63 people went silent. For exactly 2 seconds, there was nothing, no music, no clinking glasses, no polite dinner conversation. Just that sound, hanging in the air like smoke. And then my sister-in-law started clapping, not sarcastically, not nervously. She actually put her hands together, looked around the room with this wide smile, and started clapping like she was at a game show. My brother laughed. My mother pressed her lips together and looked down at her plate. Nobody moved, nobody said a word. I stood there with my hand against my cheek and thought, I have been waiting for this moment for 3 years, and I was ready. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Nora, I'm 31 years old. I'm a paralegal at a mid-sized firm in Columbus, Ohio, and for the last 4 years of my father's life, I was the person who kept him alive. Not metaphorically. I drove him to chemotherapy every other Thursday. I learned how to change his wound dressing after the surgery. I coordinated with his doctors, fought with his insurance company, sat in the hospital parking garage at 2 in the morning because I didn't want to go home to an empty apartment while he was in the ICU. I gave up a relationship over it. My boyfriend at the time told me I was emotionally unavailable because I kept leaving dinner to answer calls from my dad's home nurse. I let him go. My father needed me more. My brother Felix had a different approach. Felix lived 40 minutes away in a suburb with good schools and a finished basement and a wife named Gwen who had opinions about everything. He came to Christmas. He came to Thanksgiving when it was convenient. He sent my dad a fruit basket when the diagnosis came in, which I thought was either very thoughtful or deeply tone-deaf depending on how you looked at it. He called maybe twice a month, usually on Sundays, usually short. My father always seemed happy after those calls. He'd say Felix checked in. Like that was enough. Like checking in was the same thing as showing up. I never said anything. That was my mistake. Or maybe it wasn't a mistake. I still go back and forth on it. I thought my father could see what was happening. I thought actions spoke for themselves. I thought that when the time came he would know. I was wrong about a lot of things. My father was a civil engineer. He spent 35 years building things. Bridges, drainage systems, the kind of infrastructure nobody thinks about until it fails. He was methodical, precise. Not a man who said things he didn't mean or forgot things he'd agreed to. Which is why when he sat me down in the spring of 2021 and told me he wanted to make sure I was protected, I believed him. We were on his back porch. He had a cup of tea he wasn't really drinking. The chemo had made everything taste metallic, he said, even water. I'd brought him a lemon sorbet from the place 2 blocks away and he was holding it, but not eating it, just turning the cup in his hands like it was something to do. He told me he'd been thinking about the house, his house, the one he'd lived in for 27 years, the one my mother left when they divorced, the one I had keys to, and had been managing his mail and medications and lawn maintenance from for the last 2 years. He said he wanted it to go to me. He said he knew what I'd given up. He said he wasn't going to let that disappear into the air like it hadn't happened. I told him he didn't have to do that. He said, I know I don't have to. That's why I'm doing it. We talked about updating his will. He mentioned he had an attorney, a man named Gerald who'd done his estate planning years ago. He said he'd call Gerald that week. I nodded. I trusted my father. I had never once had a reason not to. He died 14 months later, and I found out at the reading of his will, in a room full of relatives I barely knew, that the house and almost everything else was going to Felix. I want to describe that room to you because I think about it constantly. It was Gerald's conference room. Long table, leather chairs, the kind of office that smells like carpet cleaner and old paper. Felix and Gwen sat across from me. My father's sister, my Aunt Beverly, was at the end. A few cousins I'd seen maybe 4 times in my life were there too, which felt strange. Why had they been invited? I found out later that Gwen had called them. She wanted an audience. I understand that now. Gerald read through the standard language, the preamble, the legalese. And then he got to the assets. The house, Felix. The investment accounts, Not huge, but significant, about $340,000, Felix, with a small provision for charitable donation. My father's car, his tools, the antique surveying equipment he'd collected over decades, Felix. To me, his watch, his books, and a savings account containing $200. I heard Gerald's voice the way you hear things underwater. I sat very still. I was aware of Gwen's expression. She wasn't smiling exactly, but there was something around her mouth, something pleased and contained that she was working to keep small. Felix looked at the table. Gerald finished reading and asked if there were questions. Gwen said, "I think that's all very clear." I excused myself to use the restroom. I stood in front of the sink and ran cold water over my wrists and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I thought about my father on that porch. I thought about what he'd said. I thought, something is wrong here. I went back to the table and asked Gerald if I could get a copy of the will. He said, of course, standard procedure. I asked when the current version had been drafted. He checked his notes. 11 months ago. 8 months into my father's final decline. 3 months after his oncologist had documented significant cognitive changes due to the cancer's progression to his brain. I drove home and called my friend Petra, who is sharper than anyone I've ever met, and has been my emergency contact for thinking clearly since college. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Nora, you're a paralegal. You know what undue influence means." I did. Here's what I did not do. I did not call Felix. I did not call Gwen. I did not send an emotional email at midnight or post anything or tell the cousins or call my Aunt Beverly. I went to work on Monday. I ate lunch at my desk. I pulled up every document I had ever signed or helped file on my father's behalf over 4 years of caregiving, and I found what I needed. In the fall of 2020, my father and I had signed a formal caregiver agreement, something his elder law attorney had recommended as a protective measure for both of us, for Medicaid planning purposes in case we eventually needed facility care. It was a legal contract. It specified my role, the services I provided, and compensation in the form of a future interest in the property to be formalized in his estate documents. It was witnessed and notarized. My father had signed that contract with a steady hand, 14 months before he died, when his mind was still fully his. The cognitive changes documented in his medical records came later. The new will, the one that gave everything to Felix, came after those changes were documented. I took my lunch break the following Tuesday and called an estate litigation attorney named Howard, who a colleague had recommended. I brought him copies of the caregiver agreement, my father's medical timeline, and the dates. He reviewed everything in 45 minutes and then leaned back in his chair and said, "This is a strong case." I said, "I'm not ready to file anything yet. I need to understand the timing." He nodded. He told me what I needed to watch for, what to preserve, what not to do. I took notes on a yellow legal pad the way I take notes on everything. I thanked him and went back to work. I did not say a word to anyone in my family. 4 months passed. I gathered documents. I requested my father's medical records, all of them. I obtained a copy of the original will, the one from years ago, before the revision, through Gerald's office, which I was entitled to as a named party. In that earlier document, I had been the primary heir. The provision for Felix was there but secondary, contingent. I was patient. People who are used to being overlooked get good at waiting. Then Felix and Gwen invited me to dinner. I want to be very precise about this because it matters. They invited me. Gwen sent a text that said, "We'd love to have you over. We're thinking about Dad's things and wanted to talk through some family stuff with you. Nothing heavy, just dinner." I read that text 4 times. I said yes. I drove to their house on a Saturday in March. It was one of those early spring evenings that still smells like winter. Their neighborhood has the kind of quiet that feels expensive. Gwen opened the door before I knocked, which told me she'd been watching for me. There were other people there. Not just Felix and Gwen. My Aunt Beverly, 2 cousins, Felix's college roommate who I'd met once, and Gwen's mother, a woman named Pat who had made it very clear at my father's funeral that she found me intense. 12 people around a dining table that had been extended with a leaf I'd never seen before. It had not been described to me as a dinner party. I smiled. I sat where they pointed. I ate the food and answered questions about work and watched Gwen move around the table refilling wine glasses with the specific satisfaction of someone who has organized everything exactly as they want it. The speeches started after dessert. Felix stood up and talked about my father. He was emotional, genuinely. I'll give him that. His voice broke a little when he mentioned the fishing trips they'd taken, and I thought, those fishing trips were real. That grief is real. None of this makes you the villain of the story. I held that thought carefully because it's important to me to stay accurate about people, even people who have hurt me. Then Gwen stood up. She thanked everyone for coming. She talked about how hard the last few years had been, how much Felix had been carrying, how they'd been stretched thin managing everything from a distance. Her words, while also raising their kids and maintaining their home and their commitments. She looked at me once during this part. Just once. Then she said they were planning to sell my father's house, that they'd had an appraiser out, that the market was good, and that they were planning to use the proceeds to pay off their mortgage and put money away for the kids' college funds. She said this the way you announce a vacation. Casually. To 12 people, including me. We know it's an emotional thing, she said, but we want to be smart about it. And honestly, Nora, she looked right at me now. You don't have a family to worry about. You don't have kids. It makes sense that this would go to the people who have more to carry. The table was quiet for exactly a moment. Then Felix nodded, slowly, like this was all very reasonable. I picked up my wine glass and took a small sip. I set it down. I thought about the notarized caregiver agreement in the folder in my car. I thought about Howard and his legal pad and the phrase strong case. I thought about my father's hands when he signed that contract. Steady and deliberate. Because he had always been a man who meant what he said. I said, I appreciate you sharing that. It's helpful to know where things stand. Gwen looked surprised, like she'd been expecting something different. Tears, maybe. Argument. Something she could use. I gave her nothing. Felix said, we can talk more, obviously, if you have thoughts. Of course, I said, I'll be in touch. I drove home. I called Howard the next morning. The estate litigation process is not fast. It took 8 months. I will not pretend it was easy. There were days when I sat in my apartment with all the documents spread across my kitchen table and thought about my father signing those papers. Both sets of papers in 2 different years, with 2 different states of mind, and I cried. Not because of the money or the house. Because I missed him, because I kept having to hold both things at once, the man who loved me, and the process that had failed to protect that love properly. But Howard was good, and the documentation was very good. And my father's oncologist, to her enormous credit, had been scrupulous about recording the timeline of his cognitive decline. The medical record showed exactly when the changes had begun. The new will had been signed 3 months after those records started showing significant impairment. Gwen had driven him to the attorney's office that day. Gerald, when deposed, acknowledged he had not administered any cognitive assessment before witnessing the signing. He had not known about the oncologist's notes. Felix, when deposed, could not explain why he had not mentioned the caregiver agreement to Gerald, could not explain why the prior will had been revised so dramatically in the last year of a man's life, could not explain the sequence of events without a great deal of, I don't know, and Gwen handled most of that. Gwen's deposition was different. She was sharp and prepared and gave very measured answers. But she could not produce evidence that my father had initiated the change. She could not show Gerald's communications with my father that predated the revision. What she could show was a lot of communication between herself and Gerald's office. The case settled. I will not give you the exact terms because they are confidential, but I will tell you that I kept the house. And I will tell you that the $340,000 in investment accounts was split in a way that my attorney described as very reasonable given the strength of your position. The dinner party revelation. The night Gwen announced the sale. The night Felix hit me. I haven't told you what led to that moment. Let me go back. I need to go back because the reason Felix hit me matters. At that dinner in March, I had been calm. I had said nothing about the legal process I'd already begun. But Gwen, who is not stupid, had apparently sensed something. Over the following weeks, she called twice, texted several times, tried to arrange another family conversation. I didn't respond right away. Not evasively, just slowly. The way people with full-time jobs and pending legal matters sometimes respond to messages. She escalated. She called my Aunt Beverly and apparently told her I was refusing to cooperate with settling my father's estate. Beverly called me, upset, saying she'd heard I was thinking about making things legal and that it was going to destroy the family. I told Beverly, calmly, that I was taking the time I needed to understand my options. Then Felix called. That conversation was harder. He was my brother. We had grown up in the same house, had eaten breakfast across from each other for 18 years, had called each other from college when things were hard. I loved him in the complicated way you love someone who is also disappointing you in real time. He said he hoped I wasn't going to do anything that damaged our relationship. He said Dad would have wanted the family to stay together. I said, Dad also wanted me to have the house. He told me so. Silence. He was confused toward the end, Felix said. That sentence sat in my chest for weeks. I did not argue. I said I understood and I had to go. 6 weeks later, 2 months after the legal process was formally underway, though Felix and Gwen didn't know that yet, Gwen organized a family gathering. Not at their house this time. At the banquet room of a restaurant in their suburb. 63 people, relatives, their friends, our father's former colleagues. She framed it as a celebration of life for my father, 6 months after his passing. She sent me a formal invitation with his photo on it. I went because not going would have looked like something I was hiding. And I wasn't hiding anything. I wore a dark green dress. I sat near the back. I ate the catered food and talked to my father's old colleagues, who told me stories about him I hadn't heard. And for a while, I forgot to be on guard. The speeches started again. Felix spoke. Gwen spoke. Then Gwen said something. Something about the family coming together to honor my father's wishes. Something about being grateful for how things had been handled. Something with just enough emphasis on his wishes to feel like a message directed at me. And I made a small mistake. I said, quietly, to no one in particular, to the table, mostly to myself, I hope so. Gwen heard it. She looked at me. What does that mean? I should have said nothing. Instead I said evenly, it means I hope his actual wishes are honored. She said, everything is being handled according to his will. I said, the will signed 3 months after his oncologist documented his cognitive decline. That one. I had not planned to say that out loud. It came out anyway. Years of being quiet apparently have a limit. 63 people went very still. Felix stood up. I looked at my brother, my actual brother, the person I had known my entire life, and watched him cross the space between us, and I thought, don't, and then I thought, oh. The sound echoed. Gwen started clapping, not because she'd lost her mind, I think, but because she'd panicked and her body did the wrong thing. 3 seconds of applause before someone next to her put a hand on her arm. I stood up. My cheek was burning. I was shaking slightly, which happens to me when adrenaline hits, but my voice was steady when I spoke. I need everyone to understand something, I said. My father told me in the spring of 2021 that he wanted me to have his home. We signed a formal caregiver agreement reflecting that intent, witnessed and notarized, 14 months before he died, when he was fully competent. The revised will was signed after documented cognitive decline began. I have retained an attorney. The process has been underway for 2 months. I picked up my bag. Felix just assaulted me in front of 63 witnesses. I'm leaving now. I want to thank everyone who knew my father. He deserved better than tonight. I walked out. Nobody stopped me. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for a while with my hands in my lap, and then I called Howard and left him a voicemail describing what had happened. Then I drove home, stopped at an urgent care clinic on the way to document the injury to my face, and took photographs of my cheek with my phone in the fluorescent light of the exam room. That documentation was added to the case file. Felix did not face criminal charges. That was my decision. And I thought about it a great deal. People in the comments of stories like mine always say press charges, and I understand the impulse. I felt it too for a while. But I made a calculation. I was already in a legal process that was going well. Adding a criminal matter would have complicated the timeline in ways that didn't serve me. I documented everything. I consulted my attorney. And then I made a choice that was about my own peace of mind as much as strategy. I did not want to spend more of my life in rooms where Felix was present. The settlement came through on a Tuesday morning. Howard called me while I was eating oatmeal at my kitchen counter. He walked me through the terms. I sat very still and took notes on a legal pad, same as always. When he finished, I thanked him. I hung up. I sat there for a while. I thought about my father's porch. The untouched sorbet. The way he'd said, "That's why I'm doing it." Like he'd thought about it a long time before he said it. I thought about 4 years of Thursday drives and insurance holds and parking garages at 2 in the morning. I thought, he meant it. He always meant it. It just took some work to make it stick. I closed on the house 6 weeks after the settlement. It needed things: the kitchen faucet, some rot on the back porch, a wall that had been water-stained and never properly fixed. I took a weekend and walked through every room with a notebook, making lists. It felt like the most like myself I'd been in a long time. My Aunt Beverly reached out in the fall. She was careful, tentative. She asked if we could have coffee. I said yes, because Beverly had not been a participant in what happened, only a bystander who'd believed what she was told. We met at a diner near her apartment. She cried a little. She said she hadn't understood the full picture. I told her what I was comfortable sharing. We talked about my father, the real him, the bridge builder, the man who took his tea without sugar and had opinions about regional infrastructure that could fill a dinner party. We meet for coffee every few months now. It's something. Felix and I have not spoken since the banquet room. I don't know if we will. I've had people tell me I should forgive him, that he's my only brother, that my father wouldn't have wanted this. I think about those things. I also think about my father on that porch, certain that he was doing something that would last. He was right. It lasted. It just needed someone who knew how to protect it. I'm not angry anymore most days. What I am is clear. Clear about what happened. Clear about what I'm owed. Not in a bitter way. In a factual way. The way you get clear about things when you've spent a long time reading documents and sitting in deposition rooms and learning to say exactly what is true without flinching. My father built things meant to hold weight. So do I. I kept the sorbet place. It's 2 blocks from the house, still there, same flavors. I go on Sundays sometimes. I get the lemon. I sit on the porch he sat on, in the chair he liked, and I eat it slowly, and it tastes the way things taste when you have not lost them after all. I used to think that being good was enough, that if you showed up, did the work, stayed quiet, and kept your hands clean, the people who were supposed to see you would eventually see you. My father saw me. I know that now in a way I couldn't fully trust while everything was still unresolved. He saw me on that porch with the untouched sorbet in his hands, and he tried to do right by me the only way he knew how. Carefully, deliberately, with a signature and a notary and a document meant to outlast him. What I didn't understand then is that doing right by someone is only the beginning. You still have to protect it. You still have to be willing to stand in a room where people are looking at you and say the true thing out loud, even when your voice wants to shake. The night Felix hit me in front of 63 people, I was terrified. Not of him. Not really. I was terrified of what it meant that it had gotten that far. That the gap between what my father intended and what nearly happened was that wide, and that the only thing standing in it was a folder of documents I'd had the presence of mind to build over 4 years of caregiving and 8 months of legal process. An inch either way and I lose everything. I think about Gwen a lot. Not with anger anymore, but with a kind of clear-eyed recognition. She is someone who looked at my life and saw a vacuum. No husband, no children, no obvious claim. Just a woman in her 30s who had quietly given years to someone else's comfort. Which is the kind of thing people only value in retrospect, if at all. She made a calculation about me. She was wrong, but I understand the math she was doing. People who mistake quietness for weakness will always be surprised when you finally speak. That surprise is your advantage, if you're patient enough to wait for it. What Felix did, and what Gwen orchestrated, had consequences not because the universe arranged it that way, but because actions leave traces. A will signed under the wrong circumstances leaves a paper trail. A caregiver who knows her own work leaves documentation. A father who loved his daughter told her so and she wrote it down. Choices accumulate. Over time, they become a record, and records can be read by people who know how. I'm not a perfect person. I made mistakes in this. I said the true thing in a room when I should have waited 2 more weeks for the settlement to finalize, and it cost me a bruised face and an adrenaline crash in a parking lot. I let years pass without protecting what my father promised because I trusted that love was its own kind of documentation. It isn't. Love is the reason. Documentation is the tool. What I want to say, to anyone who has ever been in a room where someone counted you as nothing, is this: your value is not determined by who acknowledges it in public. It is determined by what you actually did, what you can prove, and whether you had the discipline to build something solid while everyone else was busy looking somewhere else. Nora kept her father's house, not because she was lucky, because she showed up for 4 years when nobody was watching, and then she kept showing up in courtrooms and deposition rooms and an urgent care clinic on a Saturday night, and she did not stop until what was true became what was documented. That is not revenge. That is just what happens when you refuse to disappear.